I've owned my dehydrator for about 15 years now. It was probably the first more specialist piece of kitchen equipment that I bought, and over the years it's become totally indispensable to me. I use it all the time, from everyday simple tasks to some of my favourite more modern techniques. So today I'm going to show you the dehydrator and how it works, and then go through some of the various things that I use mine for. From simple drying and preserving of ingredients through to making more complex elements of dishes and things like the fruit glass or vegetable crisps that I make. The dehydrator is a very simple bit of kit, basically just a box with a heating element and a fan, but it's a real workhorse and you'd be surprised how many different things you can do with this. There probably isn't as much excitement around these as there should be really, and I think that's partly because they just work and they're not as flashy as things like the rotovac or using liquid nitrogen or the ultrasonic baths, all of which are things that I use and I feature on here of course. But the dehydrator is so useful and represents such good value that I think it can get a little bit overlooked. It allows you to do quite a lot of exciting stuff really, alongside a lot of very practical everyday things. I'm going to be showing you the specific Excalibur dehydrator that I use, which is the 9 tray version. They come in different sizes and finishes if you need something a little bit smaller for instance, and I don't have any link to the company, but I think you'll quite quickly get the impression through the video that I love mine. There are cheaper brands and other shapes available, but this is something where for me it's worth buying once and buying right. Mine has been so reliable that really it represents fantastic value for all the years that I've been using it. And I also feel very confident and safe in leaving this running for long periods of time. Just anecdotally, I did once when I was working as a development chef get sent a cheaper brand dehydrator to do some recipe testing with, only for that to be followed with an urgent email coming through saying I mustn't use it and that they'd been getting reports of these particular units setting on fire. Safety is obviously a really big concern with pieces of equipment like this because you're letting them run for a long period of time. And with my Excalibur, I've owned it for 15 years and never had any issues with it. So that gives me peace of mind and makes me feel a lot safer leaving this running. So now to look at the dehydrator itself, as I say, it's basically a big plastic box with a heating element and a fan. And the positioning of these means that you get a nice even airflow across the trays and things dry nice and evenly. The door on the front of the dehydrator lifts off completely to let you in and out of it easily on my model. And then inside the dehydrator you can see the trays, which also can be removed completely for ease of use. The trays have these screen inserts which allow for the best possible airflow if you're drying anything solid. And then Excalibur also make these non-stick sheets which are great for anything a bit more delicate or semi-liquid, things like purees and some of the techniques that I'll show you in a little bit. These are good quality and easy to clean, and I'll sometimes also use silicone mats in the dehydrator. Then on the top here I have manual temperature controls and a timer. These are pretty basic, but they're accurate enough for me. Excalibur do make versions with digital controls, but honestly I found this absolutely fine for everything that I'm doing. Then I think the best way to show you what I love about this is to show you how I use it, from preserving seasonal ingredients to making items for the menu. I'm going to go through a number of techniques now, and some of those I have some more in-depth videos on already, and in that case I'll link to them down in the description. These aren't in any particular order. I'm going to kind of jump back and forth between more simple and chefy techniques, but I'll put in chapter sections so you'll be able to come back to particular elements if you want to. Let's start with something chefy that I've featured on here before, the fruit glass that I make for a couple of dishes. This is really just a refinement of making fruit leathers, which is also something you can do with a dehydrator. For this technique, I heat up a base of fruit juice with some NH pectin, and then let that set into a soft gel. Once that's set, I can gently rewarm that fruit juice base until it's just melted, and then spread it very thin on the dehydrator sheets. Then these get dried at 45 degrees in the dehydrator for an hour until the mixture is sort of pliable. Then I can remove those sheets and make torn pieces for abstract shapes. But you could also cut these into more precise shapes or use a stencil. Then once these are dried, I store them in airtight tubs with silica packets to keep them dry and crisp until I'm ready to serve them. I store quite a lot of things that I make in the dehydrator that way to keep them at their best until they're ready to use. There's a lot more detail about this technique and the dishes that I use it for in the dedicated video that I made about it, so as I say, that'll be linked down in the description. Next, maybe the most obvious use for the dehydrator is drying and preserving ingredients. Sometimes that might be quite standard things like mushrooms or other vegetables and fruits, and I might want to do that to change their texture or to use them for things like stocks. But it's also very useful for things that have brief seasons and some of the wild foods that I work with. So with spring nettles, for example, I dry those very gently and then I use the dried nettles to make a cold infused dashi as one of the stocks that I use in the nettle soup that I make. I also use the dehydrator to very gently dry flowers, and sometimes that might be to make crystallized flowers, or sometimes to dry things like hawthorn flowers or chamomile, either to make oils or in making gin. Gin's quite an interesting example actually, I think, because whilst I use vacuum distillation to preserve some very fresh, delicate flavours, that's equipment obviously most people don't have access to. Smaller copper stills for making gin are much more affordable, and I found when making gin in the copper still that some of the ingredients I would sometimes prefer in their dried form, that the flavour came through better in the finished gin with things like dried chamomile or meadowsweet. Again, I've got a full video about the process of making gin with a little copper still, and it's an example of why if an ingredient's in season and you've got a lot of it, drying some of it can be a good option, and then you can always decide what you might want to do with it later. As we're talking about preserving ingredients, I'll also just quickly touch on the idea of using dehydrators for fermentation. Because they give you temperature control, you can use the dehydrator to create an optimal environment for different types of fermentation. I know some people use them for things like yogurt making and have even used them for making koji. Now, whilst I don't do that because I have a dedicated incubation setup, I can totally understand how you might want to explore this if this is something you already own. Let's look at another more chefy technique again now, and these vegetable crisps are another thing that's very effective that I make in part using the dehydrator. This is another thing that I already have a full video on, so you'll be able to find in-depth details there, but I'm going to summarise the technique for you here. Basically, I take my vegetables and cook them. Here I'm doing that in the water bath, and then they get combined with corn flour, isomalt, glucose and salt and blended well together. That mixture gets cooked out a little bit as well, and then you can use it to make a whole variety of different shapes. You can use the puree spread over stencils or with intricate silicone molds. Then this is the stage where I use the dehydrator to then dry that vegetable puree until it's in a semi-dry, pliable state. Once the puree is semi-dried and flexible, the shapes can be carefully removed from their molds or peeled away from their non-stick surface. Then these get very lightly cooked in oil before going through a final drying stage again. This is a really useful and versatile technique. You can make all sorts of different shapes and objects with this, and you can work with a huge range of different ingredients. I've adapted this technique to use with spruce needles before for my pine forest sorbet. Next, I want to touch on using the dehydrator for evaporation of liquids and very gentle reductions. Now, this isn't going to let you get results like I do using the Rotavap, but again, this is a much more accessible piece of equipment for most people. The idea here is that you can put a liquid in a wide tray and let the dehydrator speed up the process of evaporating water from it. This still takes quite a long time, so it's not really great for delicate or fresh flavours, but the way that I have used this is in making my own salt. For that, I'd collected my own seawater, and then I used the dehydrator to evaporate off the water, allowing me to form these lovely large salt crystals. Once the salt crystals are formed, they can be delicately lifted out of the tray, and then they go back in the dehydrator for a final drying again. This is another thing where I have a video about that whole process, so do check that out if this is something that's interesting to you. Just quickly, I'm going to go through another kind of chefy technique that I actually don't use very often anymore, but you can use a dehydrator to make these little dried meringues. These can be made with basically any liquid, which is then whipped and dried into crisp meringues. The technique's very adaptable and versatile, so I've done different sweet and savoury versions of these. In the past, I've made savoury beetroot meringue or stout meringue, and then I used to have a dish where I would make little sake and peach meringues as an element for it. And then I also used to do a dried meringue that I made with an infusion of rose hips that worked well. I'll put a couple of recipes for this down in the description, so again you can get a bit of a sense of the method and see if this is something you might want to play about with. Lastly, there's a whole range of ways that I use the dehydrator where it's not really a full technique, but it's just a really helpful step for a part of it. For example, when I make my herb oils, part of the process for that is that the herbs get very quickly blanched and then refreshed in ice water, and then they need to be dried off a little before they're ready to blend with the oil. You could let those herbs just dry off on a tray at room temperature, but again, using the dehydrator just gives you a little bit more consistency and convenience. And here, it's not crucial, but I do think that it helps me ultimately to get better quality herb oils. Then there's the vegetable charcuterie that I make, that's cured and then inoculated with koji. The final step for that process is that it gets dried down to 50% of its weight. And again, you could let this happen through slow air drying, but using the dehydrator lets me really control that environment and process. So again, I feel like it's bringing in this element of precision and consistency that allows me to get reliably high quality results. And then something else small but really valuable to me is being able to use this to warm up my chocolate grinder before I go through the process of making chocolate. That might not seem like too big of a deal, but it's really important for the chocolate making process that you're able to warm up the grinding stones before you start adding in your ingredients. And again, because I can easily take the trays out of the dehydrator, I'm able to put the whole top section of my chocolate grinder in there to pre-warm before I start making my chocolate. And I suppose this sums up a lot of what I love about the dehydrator. It's this combination of simplicity and versatility. There's a lot of specific techniques, like some of the ones that I've shown you, where you need the dehydrator to achieve a particular effect. But there's also so many ways that I just use it day to day to make processes either easier or faster or more consistent. So I hope that I've given you a good outline of at least some of the ways that I use my dehydrator and why I'm so enthusiastic about it as a great value piece of equipment. If you're interested in some of the other slightly unusual equipment that I use in the kitchen, then I've got videos about things like the Rotavap, the centrifuge that I use, or the ultrasonic baths. And as I've mentioned, a lot of the techniques that we've covered today have their own in-depth videos too, if you'd like to learn more about them. I hope this has been useful if you're thinking about getting a dehydrator or looking for some ways to use one that you already own. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.